For those of you that are on this side of the sanctuary, welcome. I'll be preaching to you today primarily. I'll move towards the middle in a minute. You'll see soon why I've moved off to the side here. So as Ben Gross mentioned, we've got a number of our people that will be flying back to Cedar Rapids today from Costa Rica. A few more that will be staying for a week of vacation. I know here in our church, Ben mentioned we haven't had anything real major happen this last week, so I appreciate that. As we said last week with the other pastors out of town, I'm so thankful that we didn't have any catastrophic emergencies. By the way, there have been times in the past where we've had multiple pastors that have been traveling and maybe one or two here on the ground, and we've had some catastrophic emergencies. I won't get into those this morning, but trust me, there's been a few occasions. So glad that didn't happen, but I do know that we have a lot of people in our church that are just flat out sick. We're such a generous congregation. We share all of our colds with each other, and about the time one person heals up, somebody else gets sick, and about that time that person gets healed up, they pass it back to the person that gave it to them. I personally have not been healthy since before Christmas, and but it hasn't been bad enough to go to the doctor, see? Yes, it has. I think the plan is tomorrow morning to go to the emergency room and see if we can get it straightened out. Well, we've got something to celebrate together this morning, and that is that if you are on the one-year Bible reading plan this past week, you made it all the way through Leviticus chapter 24. Give yourselves a hand. Oh, come on now. We are almost through Leviticus. We'll be finishing that up in the reading plan this week. We are going to have some audience participation today, so I hope that was not indicative of your enthusiasm. I'm going to need your voice here in a little bit. We'll do some practicing together. Well, our text today is going to be primarily from the first 24 chapters of Leviticus. A number of those have fallen in the reading plan from this past week, but we're also going to go back to the previous week to pick up chapters 1 through 7. Our primary point today that we're going to repeat together often is this: thank God that the law has been fulfilled by Christ. Now, you're going to see this slide about 8 times over the course of the sermon, and I'm going to ask you every time you see it beyond this one to say this together, okay? And as we go through our teaching today, I hope it becomes apparent not only why we're saying this together, but that you could feel the words of this message. So let's practice. Our primary point is to thank God that the law has been fulfilled by Christ. Okay, keep that handy. We're going to come back to it again quite a few times. Well, as we have been reading through Leviticus, those first 24 chapters, we have read a lot about the altar and the offerings, and that's why the title of today's sermon is The Altar and the Offerings. More broadly, what we've been reading about is the law. And I have to tell you, although it might be appealing and interesting to Josh, he's sicker than most of us. For me, if I'm just honest about it, reading these 24 chapters has been challenging and mysterious. It's a little bit like going to the store and buying a crossword puzzle. A jigsaw puzzle, not a crossword puzzle, a jigsaw puzzle. And you know how a lot of times we have a method where when we put together a jigsaw puzzle, maybe you do this like I do, you go through the box and you sort out all of the edge pieces and you put the edge pieces together so you know where the borders of the picture are going to be. And then if you feel like cheating a little bit, you might prop up the box cover so that you can see what you're going to be making. Does everybody build their puzzles that way? The way that I feel about Leviticus is that we neither have any edge pieces nor do we have a cover on a box to look at. It just feels very mysterious because if you think about the context of the way that Leviticus was written, we have no context, right? The people in the nation of Israel didn't have the New Testament that we have the benefit of having today. What they had was the law. That's all they knew. And if I put myself in their shoes, what I might have felt often was, God, where is this going? What can I expect tomorrow and next week and next month? Because all that I seem to be experiencing on a day-to-day basis is a lot of guilt, a lot of sin, a lot of need for sacrifice every single day of my life. And I felt that as I have been reading through these verses. In fact, in the book of Leviticus itself, there are more than 250 references to offerings. In all of Scripture, there are about 500 references to offerings, so half of all of those are in the book of Leviticus. Why was God so specific about the tabernacle? We read a little bit about the tabernacle last week, its construction. Why was he so specific about the various sacrifices that would be required by the nation of Israel? And why was he so specific about the way he viewed what it meant to be clean and what it meant to be unclean? I have no idea. That's what's mind-boggling about all of it. You know, you can read through commentaries about the Old Testament. There's a lot of people that try to pick out the symbolism of every verse of the Old Testament, every portion of the law, every portion of the sacrifice, and try to connect all the dots. And there may be some value in that. For example, you may remember reading this past week that when you are bringing a grain offering, we'll talk about a grain offering here in a moment. As you bring that to the altar, the grain offering is specifically to be of unleavened bread, okay, no yeast. But it also is specifically to have salt in it, so not one but the other. Why? I don't know. God knows. Now, if you are trying to connect all the dots in the Old Testament, one thing that you might look at is that when the nation of Israel was leaving Exodus, as we read about a month or so ago, you remember that God asked that his people make loaves of unleavened bread. Why? Because they were in a hurry to get out of Dodge, okay? So they weren't waiting for the bread to rise. Now we are in Leviticus. Perhaps that's symbolic of wanting the nation of Israel to go back and remember the Exodus always. Why was salt added? Well, salt is a preservative, so maybe that was added so that that bread might stand up for a day or two. I don't know if those things are true or not true, but it's possible to see that kind of symbolism in many parts of what we've read in Leviticus. But to me, it is just, again, it's mind-boggling that God was so specific about all of these things that were important to him. Now, most of what we're going to be talking about today are the sacrifices that were made on the altar, at the entryway, or the doorway to the tabernacle, also called the tent of meeting. And again, this is something that God was very, very specific about. We see in Exodus chapter 27, this was our reading from February 9th, that the altar was specifically 7.5 feet tall, 7.5 feet wide, a perfect square. It was 4.5 feet tall. It was made of acacia wood, and on top of the acacia wood, it was covered entirely in bronze. On each of the corners of the altar, there was an ornament of a head. And as we already talked about earlier today, there was a whole lot of blood all the time that was being sprinkled on the sides of the altar. Not only on the sides of the altar, on the priests that were attending to the altar. Day and night. And we'll get into a little bit of that as we go through this. Just to give us a visual representation of what that looked like. Johnny, come on up. Sam, come on up. I need tall guys. Where are some more tall guys? Ben Gross, come on up. Mr. Wynette, come on up. Okay? Alicia, go sit down. Hey, Alicia, in just a minute, I'm going to demonstrate 4.5 feet tall. You might Hey, she brought it on. All right. Okay. We're gonna measure the size of the altar here. Okay, so Johnny, I'm gonna have you stand right here. Okay, right there. All right, 7.5 feet. Hold the end. 7.5 feet, 7.5 feet, 7.5 feet, 7.5 feet. Right. Come on back over here. We're good. We're good. 7.5 feet. Right there. Ben Gross. Right there.
Right here.
Yep. A little closer. Okay. Perfect. Now, let's take that. All right. Daniel, 7.5 feet. Ben, can you hold that, please? Come on way back to the wall. Okay, 7.5 feet right there. C90 right there. Okay. Sam, other corner. Daniel, if you'll hold that, please. All right, 7.5 feet right here. All right, thank you. These are the dimensions of the altar as provided to us in the book of Leviticus, okay? Perfect square. Again, on the corners, we've got ornaments. Thousands upon 10,000s of animals were being burned here all the time. Now, 4.5 feet tall. Alicia, come on up. All right, right here in the middle. All right. Let's measure 4.5 feet. Okay, so turn around. Right about where the Carhartt emblem is, okay, on Alicia's shirt. That's 4.5 feet high. That's the height of the altar, okay? So that's what our altar looks like. Now, as those sacrifices are being made, of course, what happens as wood and animals are being burned? We get big piles of ashes, okay? And so those ashes are being dumped at the bottom of the altar and then carried out by the priests on a daily basis. As anything that is being sacrificed is brought to the altar that has blood in it, that blood is being splashed all along the sides of the altar and along the top of the altar. This thing is a bloody mess all of the time, literally. Can you imagine what that must have smelled like? Can you imagine what it looked like? Can you imagine what an intimidating place that would be to stand next to this square and see what the nation of Israel was being commanded to do every single day? Again, to me, just mind-boggling to think about what we read about here in Leviticus. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. As I said, the fire that was on the altar was required to never go out unless the tent of meeting was being moved to another location. We read about that both in Leviticus chapter 6, verse 9, and also in verse 13. That was our reading from February 17th. The priest that was tending to the altar was on duty all night. And God is even specific about what the priest had to wear when the priest was tending to the altar. There were official linens. We read about this in Exodus. Official linens that were crafted for Aaron and his sons, the only men who could serve as priests at that time. There were outer garments, outer limits that the men had to wear, and there were specific undergarments that the men had to wear as they were tending to the altar. Now, when they cleaned the altar, and they had all these piles of ash and animals that they had to deal with on a daily basis, they would clean it off, and then God said, you have to change your clothes. These clothes that you're wearing are only clothes that you're wearing to tend to the altar. So you got to change those clothes, get into something else, and now you're going to take these burned animals, anything that's left of them, as well as the ashes from the acacia wood, and you're going to walk outside the camp to a place that's ceremonially clean, and then you're going to dump the ashes. Then you're going to come back into the camp, and you're going to put on your official priestly clothes again and go back to your duties. And there had to be a priest that was on duty all of the time, because as we're going to read about a little bit later in Leviticus, You, as a child of God, as an Israelite, could not approach God on your own. You could not approach the altar of God on your own. It was critical, necessary, demanded by God that a priest be present with you. Again, God was so very specific. As we said, offerings are mentioned about 500 times in all of Scripture, half of those in the book of Leviticus. But as you were going through your reading, you saw that there were a lot of other things that were repeated over and over and over again. I think our one that we enjoyed the most was the phrase, the long lobe of the liver. You remember that from your reading? 8 times we read about the long lobe of the liver. I had no idea what that was, so I looked it up, and after looking it up, I still really don't know what it is, except to say that our liver has 2 lobes, and one is bigger than the other. Did you know that? The right lobe of your liver is bigger than your left lobe. So that's what's being referenced here in the book of Leviticus. Your right lobe of your liver, mentioned 8 times as part of the sacrifice in the Old Testament. Blood is mentioned 66 times in the book of Leviticus, and sin is mentioned 65 times. And I'll bet there's a pretty close correlation between those 2 words, blood and sin. To be unclean is mentioned 86 times in Leviticus. The word atonement that Josh began sharing about during the Lord's Supper today is mentioned 49 times in the book of Leviticus. And the priests are mentioned more than 150 times in this book. Josh began earlier to describe what atonement meant in the Old Testament and what it means for us as sons and daughters of God in the new covenant. Atonement, as I said, is mentioned 49 times specifically in the book of Leviticus. The Hebrew word for atonement is pronounced kafar. In English, it looks like it's spelled K-A-F-A-R. Of course, in Hebrew, that's entirely different lettering, kafar. And what it means is to completely make amends for what has happened. The priest shall make atonement on his behalf, the sinner's behalf, for the sin which he has committed, and it will be forgiven him. This is a phrase that's repeated over and over and over in the book of Leviticus. Let me read that again. The priest shall make atonement on his behalf, not on the priest's behalf, on the sinner's behalf. The priest shall make atonement for the sin which has been committed, and it will be forgiven him. No priest, no atonement. That's the way God made it work. And so there had to be a priest on duty all the time as offerings were being brought to the altar. We always had to go through the priest to become clean. We'll talk about the connection to the New Testament a little bit later. Now, let's practice together as we look at all of what we've already seen in Leviticus. We haven't even gotten knee-deep yet. Can we say this together? Thank God that the law has been fulfilled by Christ. Now, let's talk about all those offerings. God required offerings of his people's most perfect possessions to either pay for their sin or to seek God's approval. Not every sacrifice that was brought to the offering was specifically for sin. We'll see a couple that were not. There are 5 primary offerings that are talked about at the beginning of the book of Leviticus. 3 were for sin, 2 were not. The first one that we see in Leviticus chapter 1, this is our reading from February 16th and 17th, was the burnt offering. And with each of these, I've tried to condense this into a really brief description. Although, as I was mentioning to Michelle just the other day, there is so much to absorb about each of these offerings. We're not going to be anywhere close to doing justice today to understanding the importance of each one of these and the intricacies of them, both how they were similar and different to one another. But here's just a summary. The burnt offering was voluntary, but was also made daily, which in my mind is like, okay, voluntary, but people are doing it every day. How voluntary was that? It consisted of a male without defect, so not a human male, of course, either a bull, a sheep, a goat, doves, or pigeons, and which animal that you used was most closely associated with where your standing or your position was within the nation of Israel. Were you a priest? Were you a leader? Were you a male? Were you richer or poorer? Depending on your standing in the community, you might move from bull to sheep to goat to dove to pigeon, depending on what you could afford. The purpose of the burnt offering was to atone for sinfulness, which was transferred from the sinner to the animal, and then it was entirely burned. Now, what kind of sinfulness? General sinfulness. You mean like, I did something specifically wrong, and I know that I did that, and I'm coming with my burnt offering? No, not really that kind of sinfulness. Like the kind of sinfulness that probably took place, but you may not even be sure about. Maybe unintentional sinfulness. Maybe a man or a woman, you secreted something in the evening in your bed, and you didn't even know it. You came to the altar voluntarily / not voluntarily with your burnt offering. And as you came, you placed that animal, you gave it to the priest. It was placed on top of that 4.5-foot altar. Your hand would go on the head of the animal. The animal would be slaughtered. And as you did so, the sin that you committed, whether intentional or unintentional, was transferred to that animal, and the priest offered atonement to God for your sin, and for a split-second moment in time, you could walk away a sinless person. The blood then was sprinkled along the sides of the altar. Sometime in the middle of the evening or early in the morning, the priest would carry all those ashes away, as we talked about before. That was the burnt offering. Interesting that with the burnt offering, it was an entirely burned offering. As we read through some of these, we see that there were some offerings that were participatory. In other words, some of the meat that was being brought from those animals was going to either be eaten by the priests, or you might even eat it yourself. In this case, all of that animal was burned. There was nothing left to be consumed by either the priests or the person that brought the offering. That's the burnt offering. Can you imagine coming to the altar of God every day for sins that you may or may not be aware of, and offering one of those 5 types of animals to pay for your sin, knowing that minutes later, hours later, within a day later, you were going to be right back at the altar? Because there was going to be some intentional or unintentional general sin in your life that had to be paid for again on that very day. Can we say this together? Thank God that the law has been fulfilled by Christ. The second offering that we're going to look at is from Leviticus chapter 2. This is our reading from February 16 and 18. It's the grain offering. Now, the grain offering was not an offering to pay for the penalty of sin, but rather its purpose was a worshipful purpose. God commanded that the grain offering be brought really to do 2 things. One was to provide for the Levites, Aaron and his sons, the priests of the nation of Israel. The other was for the people of Israel to worship God with the best of what they had. In this case, with grain. Now, the grain was to be ground into the finest flour. And when we look at the word fine there, you might think of it in one of 2 ways. One is more correct than the other. When you think of fine flour, you might think of expensive flour, like the best kind of flour that we have. That's not really what that word means. The finest flour would be flour that has been ground down to its finest consistency. Now, that in and of itself does demonstrate fineness, because in order for that flour to be produced, as those of you know who maybe make your own bread and crush those berries, right, to get the finest flour possible requires the most effort. And so you're bringing those wheat berries or perhaps barley. You're adding olive oil to that. No leaven, no honey, as we talked about before, but you must have salt. And you might produce thicker loaves or thinner loaves. As I mentioned, there was no sin that was attached, so no blood in a grain offering. Some of that was burned, and the rest was given to the priests, and the priests had the opportunity to eat that particular offering. That is the grain offering. Here's something interesting to think about. Where had the nation of Israel been just prior to all these commandments being given? Egypt. Where are they now? In the middle of the desert. And are they stagnant, staying in one place for really long periods of time, or are they moving around? They're moving around. So think about this. There wasn't any farming being done. The nation of Israel wasn't planting and harvesting crops of wheat or of barley. So where'd the grain come from? It either had come out of Egypt with them, or it was something that they were purchasing with money that they had from the riches that also had come out of Egypt with them. So just an interesting fact to consider. The nation of Israel were not farmers at this point in time. This was not grain that they were raising on their own. This was a sacrifice that was coming out of whatever wealth each family had that they were offering back to God. Now, the third offering we read about is the peace offering. You might also see it noted as the fellowship offering. Again, this was from our reading on February 16th and again on the 18th. The peace or fellowship offering was an animal, a male or female, without defect, from the herd or from the flock. So there were a number of animals that could have been part of the peace offering, male or female. Some of this offering was burned, some was given to the priest to eat, and some of it was eaten by the offerer. One of the offerings that we haven't talked about yet, because it's not an offering in and of itself, but it was kind of fun to read about, was the wave offering. Do you remember the wave offering? Either that loaf of bread, yeah, Andy, yeah, everybody stands up and does the wave. No, either that loaf of unleavened bread, or the breast of the meat that you were bringing to the altar, or the thigh of the meat that you're bringing to the altar. Do you remember what God commanded? Before you place it on the altar, what do you do with it? You wave it in the air. I'm just picturing what it looked like for thighs to be waved in the air. So when you read about the wave offering, that was in combination with other offerings that were being had. And again, the peace or fellowship offering, maybe the reason it was called the fellowship offering is because it was something that you were doing together. You were eating of it. The priest was eating of it. In a sense, God was eating of it. It was placed on his altar to be burned. And the purpose of the peace or fellowship offering was to designate to God, hey, I'm thankful for something that you have done for me. It might have been the completion of a vow that you had made to God. It might have been a way of demonstrating your thankfulness to God for something that he had done for you. Maybe a herd that was blossoming, right? Growing, expanding. Maybe your wealth was expanding. It was certainly as well a free will offering. And so that peace or fellowship offering, again, not for sin, okay, but the one that was the most participatory from all the parties involved. That's the third. The fourth offering. Now we get to the two that are like heavy, okay? From Leviticus chapter 4 that we read on February 17th, the sin offering. A bull without defect, or a male goat without defect, or a female goat without defect, again, depending on your position within the nation of Israel. The purpose of the sin offering was to recognize a very specific sin, both an intentional and unintentional, but specific sin in your life of an individual person or of a leader or of an entire community, the whole community of the nation of Israel, a specific sin that you were aware of might have been, I just killed my neighbor. That's pretty specific sin, okay? What sin would have been required? What offering would have been required for that? It would have been this offering, the sin offering. Okay? What would be an unintentional sin? Here's an example of an unintentional sin. I live here. My neighbor lives here. My neighbor's neighbor lives here. I saw my neighbor kill the other neighbor. I didn't do it. I saw it happen, but I didn't report it. I didn't come forward and talk about how I saw my neighbor kill the other neighbor. Not my sin, an unintentional sin, right? I didn't commit it, but when you recognize by reading through the law, oh, I was supposed to go tell the priest about that. You had to come and make a sin offering. So specific, intentional or unintentional sins of a person, of a leader, or of the entire community of the nation of Israel. And along with the sin offering, I'm going to skip the next primary point slide, Renee. Let's go to the guilt offering. Hand in hand, sin and guilt. The guilt offering from Leviticus chapter 5, a female lamb or goat, 2 doves or pigeons, or flour. Okay? Why the range? Again, because of your economic status. Flour, the least expensive. A bull, the most expensive. Every single person, because of the sin of their life, was going to experience guilt. And because we were going to experience guilt on a daily basis, we had to have an offering to pay for our guilt in combination for paying for our sin. And so this particular offering was available to everybody that had very little money and those that were wealthy. And with our guilt offering, we would bring that to the altar and we would acknowledge, God, I am not holy. I am not being holy. I might not even know all the ways today that I was not holy in the last 24 hours. I just know I wasn't. This was the offering where confession was required. Sometimes, perhaps, even confessing things that you're not even sure that you did. What was interesting about the Old Testament law, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in just a minute, is that it's pretty expansive. Commentators suggest that there are 613 specific commandments to be executed in the Old Testament law. 613 things that I have to be aware of that either define me as being clean or unclean. I can't remember 10 things on any given day. Seriously, Michelle can attest. How can I remember 613 things that I'm supposed to do or not do? Again, mind-boggling that God set this system up that way. So can we say again, thank God that the law has been fulfilled by Christ, that we don't have to worry about those 613 individual laws. You know, there was always something. There was always something. The 5 offerings that we've talked about so far are just the tip of the iceberg. Josh talked about an annual offering where the nation of Israel came together. Imagine the barbecue on that day. I mean, it was gigantic. There are all other kinds of offering ceremonies that took place because there was always something going on that required that we recognize our guilt and our sin. Here is just a small list from Leviticus chapters 8 through yesterday. There were clean and unclean animals. What can I eat? What can't I eat? What can I touch? What can I not touch? There were all kinds of rules associated with childbirth. How long after my wife has given birth do I need to wait before I can even touch her? How long do I have to wait before I can even sit in a chair that she sat in or lay on the bed that she was lying in? There's all kinds of skin diseases, from shiny skin to mold that's growing on your skin and lesions. And what color are they? And what color is the hair that's growing out of the lesion on your skin? There's mold that's in the fabric that you're wearing. There's mold in the tent that you're staying in. How do we deal with mold? How do we become unclean and clean? There's different discharges. There's a woman's menstrual cycle. There's a man's semen. All kinds of fluids coming out of our body at different stages of time that make us clean or unclean, and not just ourselves, but the person who's living in the house with us. Again, regulations about where I can sit, where I can lay down, when I can do that, depending on what kind of discharge has been associated with my body. Ladies and gentlemen, according to the Old Testament law, I highly doubt that there's anybody in the room here this morning that is clean. Highly doubt it. By the Old Testament law, we are each standing and sitting here this morning unclean in the eyes of God from an Old Testament perspective. If that isn't enough, wait, there's more. How you farm. Specific rules about the way that you would plant and harvest a field. How you make clothing. The type of yarn or wool that you use. The pattern that you stitch with. Haircuts. How long, how short. On the sides, on the top. Tattoos. That's a no-go in the Old Testament, ladies and gentlemen. How we show honor to the elderly. When an elderly person among you enters a room, you are all to stand up. If you don't, you have not honored the law of God. Again, this is the tip of the iceberg, and only from the first 24 chapters of Leviticus. Amazing. As we talked about, offerings were being made day and night. Remember, the fire on top of the altar never went out, except when the altar was being transported with the tent of meeting to a new location. The guilt offering is talked about 25 times in the book of Leviticus. The sin offering, 51 times. The peace offering, 29 times. The grain offering, 32 times. The burnt offering, 57 times in this single book of the Old Testament. Thank God that the law has been fulfilled by Christ. Can you imagine? Can you imagine living under this law? One of the benefits of having gone through Leviticus is it increased two things that I think about related to this book. And I am thankful for the book of Leviticus as a result. First, it increased in my mind an awareness and appreciation for how specific and analytical God is. Think about how specific the Old Testament law was. My friends, this could not have been made up by some guy just writing a book. Imagine the deception. Imagine the imagination of somebody sitting down and just writing out the Mosaic law and saying, hey, I'm going to pull something on these people. It's incomprehensible how specific our amazing God was in creating his law for whatever purpose that he had. And we're going to look at that purpose in a minute. But just the way that God put it together, amazing. The second appreciation that I have is how much I've been spared. How much you've been spared. From having to perform these daily rituals of being cleansed for just an infinitesimal moment of time before we've committed the next sin and we're already unclean again. The law was meant to show mankind how sinful we really are. And this is where we see a direct connection, straight from Chronicles to Romans, straight from the Old Testament to the New Testament. In Romans chapter 3, the Apostle Paul writes, verse 19, "The law applies to those to whom it was given, for its purpose is to keep people from having excuses." Its purpose isn't to save. Its purpose isn't to cleanse, not permanently. Its purpose is to keep people from having excuses and to show that the entire world is guilty before God. For no one, Paul says, no one can ever be made right with God by doing what the law commands. Nobody. The law simply shows us how sinful we are. We can't be good enough. And God knows that we can't be good enough. Paul goes on to remind us that because that is true, God needed to do something different. And of course, it was always God's plan to do something different. We know that Jesus Christ died to fulfill the law and permanently restore us to our Father. The Apostle Paul writes in Romans chapter 8, "The law of Moses was unable to save us because of our weakness and because of our sinful nature. So God did what the law could not do. He sent his own Son in a body like the bodies that we sinners have. And in that body, God declared an end to sin's control over us by giving us his Son as a sacrifice for our sins. He did this so that the just requirement of the law would be fully satisfied for us who no longer follow our sinful nature, but instead follow the Spirit." Something I want to point out in this verse, it's very, very important in our age of video games where we don't like how it's going, and so what do? We just start over. God did not start over in the New Testament. God didn't hit the restart button and say, forget about everything else that happened. No, what God did was fulfill everything that had happened. Christ was not a replacement for the old covenant. Christ was a fulfillment of the old covenant. God didn't take it away. He simply completed it on our behalf because there was no way that we could do so. It required Jesus Christ to do that. The word there for fully satisfied in the Greek is the word plerao. Plerao. And it's a really flexible word that we read about often in the New Testament. It refers most often to the fulfillment of prophecy, but it also refers to things like a net filled with fish. You remember when Jesus performed the miracle of the fish swimming into the net as the disciples were out fishing? Same word, as the fish are filling the net. Plerao. Jesus being filled with wisdom as a young boy going to the temple. Same word, plerao. It marks a perfect completion. And that, my friends, is what Jesus did for us. He perfectly completed. He satisfied the requirements of the law. The 613 laws that we had to fulfill on our own that we could never fulfill. Christ fulfilled the necessity of thousands upon thousands of sacrifices so that they would never, ever have to be made again. As you've seen several times, our primary point today, thank God that the law has been fulfilled by Christ. Amen? Let's take a moment to maybe just sit by yourself and to thank the Lord Jesus Christ for what he did for you. And then Matt and the band will come on up and we'll have one more song together.